All right, so our speaker this afternoon. Born and raised in the city of Cortland, Evan began his career at the Cortland Standard in 2006 as a staff reporter after graduating from Bucknell University. As part of his management training, he later worked in each department in the newspaper in order to learn their various positions and responsibilities. He assumed the role of publisher in July of 2013. He is the 5th generation of his family to be involved with the newspaper. Evan enjoys the outdoors, whether camping, boating, fishing, hiking, running, or skiing, as well as spending time on the St. Lawrence River with his family. At the home in Virgil that Evan shares with his wife, Jennifer, he listens to and makes music, reads, cooks, and plays fetch for the couple's golden retriever Sully. He's also a big proponent of local tourism. He served on the Convention and Visitors Bureau Board for 6 years, which is how I got to know him, and was their president for 2 years. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Evan Geibel.
Thank you very, very much. I will also not be singing today. It's been 150 years since the Cortland County Standard, as it was then called, first found its way into the hands of Central New York residents. As the newspaper of record locally, we serve a vital function not only in communicating the activities of government, business, and other groups, organizations, entities, and individuals, but in perpetuating our democracy itself. That sounds very overinflated. But Thomas Jefferson said, were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. And I'm in complete agreement with that, Mr. Jefferson. The first edition of what is now the Cortland Standard paper in June of 1867 wasn't printed on the presses owned by the original publisher, Francis G. Kinney. He explained in the inaugural issue that his equipment had yet to arrive, and so the paper rolled off the presses of the Homer Republican, now defunct. Instead, the then weekly newspaper continued only 5 years under Kinney's ownership until it and the Cortland Journal were purchased by Wesley Hooker in 1872, and then in 1876, William H. Clark, my great-great-grandfather, purchased the newspaper, and he would serve the next 51 years as editor and publisher. The combined paper was printed under the name Standard and Journal until 1879, when it was finally given the masthead we all know and love. Even from that first edition, the paper's home has been in downtown Cortland. The offices of the weekly paper were first on the Garrison block on Main Street, and then the Moore block, which is where Mullins is now. Then we went to the Mahan building on Court Street, which is now the site of a bank parking lot. And finally, we found our permanent home on the corner of Main and Tompkins Streets on the 1st of March in 1883. And we also provided space to the post office and then the YMCA and numerous other businesses on street level over the years. Now, all the upper floors are archival space for our past editions, some of which are duplicated here. There's a bunch of old typewriters and computer parts that have been stripped for useful pieces, and some very, very old pieces of printing equipment, a Linotype machine, and I think what is, if not our first press, one of our very first presses that's all the way up in the 4th floor attic, and it won't go anywhere until the building goes somewhere. They had moved a bunch of stuff all around in the late 60s as they sort of did a reorganization and the technology had changed, and so my father and his best friend would lug all this stuff all over the building and breathe in lots of ink dust and lead dust and things like that, so that worked out well. 25 years after its inception, at 4:01 p.m. on March 8th, 1892, the first 4-page daily edition came rolling off the presses. The weekly paper had a circulation of about 1,000, but that figure was tripled on the first day of the daily edition. They printed off 3,000 and gave them away free in a celebratory gesture. Business must have been good. Along with the switch to the daily format came congratulations for William H. Clark from editorials and other newspapers across the state. Apparently it was a pretty tight community, trading news back and forth. And meanwhile, the Cortland County community had also grown, and the paper had to grow to become a daily to accommodate the increased volume of news and advertising. I'd like to point out, before the switch to the daily edition, the Cortland Standard was called, quote, one of the best weekly newspapers in the state, and quote, I've never found the original. I keep repeating it and I can't cite a source, but I'm sure it was true. Before we dive into the 20th century, we can talk about the format of the daily paper. Around that time, it was not very visually appealing. It was gigantic for one, and it was full of just long, boring columns up and down, not much in the way of art. and very few stories even had what we would consider a headline these days, and they were all very short. The style of type was similar, at least. It wasn't Times New Roman, which I think was developed much later, but that's about it. The local news of the day was boiled down into brevity columns, which had rulings in larceny cases immediately following birth announcements, and an episode of a runaway horse was given about as much space as a notice of an upcoming 10-cent dinner, while a pool exhibition match might have been important enough to warrant a headline. Today, most of what we print in the local news section at least gets a headline, and we've wisely segregated the police blotter from the birth announcements and the obituaries. So you can tell which is which, sometimes on the same page, but it's pretty clear. And back at the end of the 19th century, the daily paper was printed on an 8-page flatbed press capable of printing 3,500 copies an hour. That press was retired in August of 1917 and replaced by a high-speed rotary press, which could print 16-page sections and fold and count 10,000 newspapers in less than an hour. I'll get back into the press equipment. It's of great deep interest to me. You folks just see the paper. So I'll let you know there's technology involved that I only have a very superficial understanding thereof. Moving on. In 1928, William Clark's son and my great-grandfather, Edward H. Clark, also known as Ted, became president and editor of the paper, and he served until his death on August 28, 1973. For a brief time, I'm told the Clark family also owned the daily newspaper in Norwich. Details have been lost to history, and the Evening Sun, as the paper is now called, is no longer affiliated with us. But what we've been told is that Ted Clark, when traveling to Norwich, would go armed to protect against bandits. That doesn't have the ring of truth to it. It really doesn't, but it's a good story. Now, that's not something we would print in the paper.
I want equal time. I grew up in Norwich.
The communities between here and Norwich that were the problem. Norwich was fine. May 24th, 1968 was truly a landmark year for the newspaper because once again we upgraded our press, and this is the press we still use. It had been printed for 51 years on the Rotary Press, and the newly installed 4-unit Gauss Urbanite offset press was capable of printing 20,000 32-page papers per hour, and that's still the one we use. The change from letterpress to offset printing, don't ask me to explain the difference, brought with it photo typesetting for news and advertising composition, utilizing what at that time was state-of-the-art equipment. Those apparatuses were retired long ago, however, and have been replaced by a series of computer systems. As a longtime member of the Associated Press, we've had access to regional, state, national, and international news through the wire service. Actually, when digging through a closet looking for mementos to celebrate our 150th anniversary, I actually found the certificate. I must have been the original certificate from, I believe, 1928, saying that we were officially a member of the Associated Press, and that's hanging on my wall now because it's just really neat. At first, the Associated Press came in via Teletype machine that was installed in 1943, and it was then edited and set on the Linotype machines, which were these big, bulky contraptions with a bizarre keyboard, and they would assemble the sticks of type and then form those into pages, later using hot lead. There was a lot of boiling lead in the Cortland Standard for a great many years. And actually, what I'm told is that they'd have these little bubbling ink pots, and that my great-grandfather he was able to lick his finger, dip it in the boiling hot lead, not ink, excuse me, lead, ever so briefly, and the evaporating water would protect his finger. My uncle, who worked briefly at the newspaper, apparently tried that trick, pulled his finger out too fast, and sprayed boiling hot lead all over the place. Another good story. I think it's true. Later, the news coming in on the Teletype machine was simultaneously recorded on perforated tapes by a machine in the newspaper's composing room. The composing room is where a lot of the assembly of ads gets taken care of. And so those perforated tapes were then fed into a photo typesetting machine, and they could create the text at 60 column lines per minute. In October 1971, the Associated Press photofax machine was installed, which meant we could actually get pictures from all over the world much faster by direct wire or radio photo at a rate of about 1 picture every 15 minutes, which, if anyone remembers the early days of the internet, was about the same. Following that development, news and photos were able to be received via satellite transmissions of microwave signals, captured using a big 10-foot dish on the roof, and then it went directly into our computer system. We still call the Associated Press wire stories, even though we haven't used a wire in 50 years. But the industry has its own terms, and that's what that one is. With the satellite dishes also gone, and now everything is downloaded off of a website or two, and we can get the news and the pictures pretty much instantaneously. Since the 1970s, we've also printed the Consumer News, which is a free weekly paper that is distributed to non-subscribers in rural areas. It allows our advertising to reach much further and hopefully entice some of these folks who are seeing just a small selection of the news to perhaps invest in a daily paper subscription where possible. And we mail that, actually. Let's see. In 2001, we kind of jumped forward a bit, but in between all those was this, one computer system followed by another, and also we had invested in technology that would allow us, instead of doing the painstaking taking pictures, all these things would be printed out on sheets of paper, the articles, the photos, etc. And we would have a big camera and we'd take a picture of the page, and from that we would develop film, and that film would then be put on a plate burner, which would burn the image from the negative film to the actual printing plate, which was then hung on the press. So in 2001, we added a new unit to the offset press that we had installed in 1968. So it's now a 5-unit press, and that allows us to actually put color on the front and back of each section, as well as one color on the inside page of the section. And that's pretty common for small newspapers our size to not have a full color newspaper. Some do, or others actually send out for printing other papers, but we've got a big, beautiful press that's meticulously maintained and fantastic people working it, so I don't want to give up our, that component of our business to somebody like Binghamton or Syracuse, who are essentially competitors. So no, you can't have it. Also, as I said, we moved to a completely computerized system, and that actually allowed us, since about 2001, to digitally archive our articles. And since 2008, we had installed a new system that allows us to digitally archive articles and the accompanying photos along with the pictures of the page. So we have a fairly complete archive. And I say fairly because we actually, in February, had a system crash, and we lost our archives for a number of months. We had to send our computer server out to California, where some incredible work was done, and we have the archives back, and we're trying to catch up still, but it's been a real bear for reporters. They have to actually flip through the newspapers to find the stories, which is what they did to a generation ago anyways, every day, so poor guys. And since May of 2006, some of the news and sports articles in the paper, as well as birth and death notices, have appeared online at cortlandstandard.net. And we gave that website facelift in October of last year, and we're currently positioning the paper for a more digital approach in the very near future, I hope. And we are doing research, and once again, it involves buying very costly software to figure out exactly, seeing how over time I am yet. Oh, I'm doing very well. So we're exploring the digital side of things. And the Cortland Standard is one of only a handful of independently owned and operated daily newspapers remaining in the state, and continues to be published under the ownership of descendants of the Clark family. We are actually the second oldest independently owned and operated newspaper in New York State, and that's right behind the Rome Sentinel, and we are the 8th oldest in the country.
Wow.
To get back to the Clark family a little bit, Ted Clark's son-in-law, and my grandfather, Paul Geibel, assumed the duties of president and publisher in 1973 upon his father-in-law's death. And he was actively involved in the newspaper daily operation until his own death in March 3rd of 1999. His own son-in-law, my uncle Kevin Howe, served as publisher from 1986 until I became publisher on July 1st of 2013. And Kevin, for the first time in the newspaper's history since my family took it over, retired at the end of last year. So he did not die at his desk, and I think he's very relieved of that. So kudos to him. My father, Steve Geibel, currently serves as the president of the company. And so that's how I get to my 5th generation. I've spent time working in every department, as Mindy had said, and I have good working knowledge of what every position of the paper entails. When I was a reporter, I covered the city of Cortland and town of Cortlandville for a year or two, and then I moved on to Cortland County and spent a couple of years there. From there, I went to circulation, delivered papers, answered phones, handled customer complaints, and then I made a jump to the business office for a few months, and then to the classified department, and then I went back to the business office, and then up to the newsroom, and then I went to the IT department and worked a bit in setting up ads and things like that. And then I went down to the press room, and I think in between that I went back to the business office. And I got covered in ink, bled a little, broke some stuff, and then they made me community page editor where I could do less damage. And I did that for a good bit, and that was some really good editing work. And then I pretended to be a salesman in the ad room for a while. And since then, I've been on the business side of things as assistant to the publisher, and in that role is when I actually last visited the Historical Society to give a talk, and then general manager for a couple of years before I finally wound up as a publisher. So what's a day at the Cortland Standard like? We'll start at the basis of the whole enterprise, the paper. Once a month, twice a month if it's a really good month. A tractor trailer from Canada arrives with about 20 tons of newsprint, which we unload into our basement. The paper comes in rolls, either 25 inches wide or 12.5 inches wide, although the 12.5 inches wides are shipped as 25 inches bound together. And they all have a diameter of about 40 inches. We use about 20 tons a month as well, although it varies depending on the number of special sections, such as our 150th. By the way, the 150th anniversary edition, for anyone who doesn't already have one, I brought a few copies, so feel free to take one, because we're celebrating. And newsprint is actually our second largest expense after personnel, so it is expensive to print a newspaper. We have about 50 employees, give or take a few depending on the season. In the fall, as it gets close to a Thanksgiving, there are a lot more of those inserts, advertisements in the paper, which means we need to have a lot of people there to get them in there and then carry them around. If you've ever seen the carriers on those days, they have 2 bags full, and sometimes they have to come back to the paper and get more. Everyone else calls it Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. We're focused on Black Wednesday, the day before Thanksgiving. I've thrown out my back for years, actually helping out in that department, and now finally I say, I'm sorry, I've got a tie on, I can't do it anymore. And we also have a bunch of newspaper carriers in the city. They are not our employees, they purchase the papers from us, and independent motor route dealers who most people in rural areas actually purchase the papers directly from, and in turn they also purchase the day's load of newspapers from us. Much of the work of the daily newspaper is actually completed before publication. Reporters, hopefully, will have gotten their interviews completed the day before and the story written and ready for editing. Of course, there are often meetings at night, almost always meetings at night, that have to be covered, and breaking news stories that need to be fleshed out, whether it's an alligator or an accident. So the reporters do sometimes work late into the night, either at home or in the office, and sometimes come in early in the morning to finish up writing, although they really shouldn't. We want stuff filed as early as possible to give time for editing and to keep things flowing. Reporters have odd hours, as you could probably guess. It's not unusual for them to get to the office around 8 or 8:30, leave around 11:30 after all the questions are answered and the paper's gone to press, and then return late in the afternoon before running off to an evening meeting. I ate takeout every night when I was a reporter. That was partially poor planning, but also because I had a lot of 6 p.m. meetings, 7 p.m. meetings, things like that, that just didn't give much time to be a productive human being otherwise. And when you're a reporter on call for emergencies, fires, major police actions, accidents, flooding, you never know when you'll have to get out and get a story. I actually went out and covered flooding in Cincinnatus and DeRuyter. My first day as publisher, we were running low, so I grabbed my own camera and went out to those areas and tried to get some good copy for the newsroom. And now we mostly think of the news, which we call editorial, end of things, and we think newspaper. You have to remember that the ads just don't materialize out of thin air, although sometimes they sort of do. Well, it's because some advertisers either have somebody in-house who sends us an ad, or they contract with an ad agency which will produce the ads and just send those along. And we like that. It saves our people a bit of work. It also can create problems because you have to make sure that the ads all are the right file format, that everything's put together properly, so when it hits our computer system, for example, you don't have a picture of a person drop out and you just get an ad with a big hole in it, and that does occasionally happen. So our ad reps are running around local stores, restaurants, businesses, things like that, and trying to get advertisers to agree to run the ad or a package or sign a long-term contract. and then they work with the client to get an idea of really what they're looking for and what's possible in the space they can afford. We also really try to steer the ads and the advertisers toward designs that have the best chance of working out well on newsprint, which is not glossy magazine quality. It is newsprint, you all know. And some ads, between the ink in the paper, just if you have really tiny spindly writing, it's going to make it difficult to get it right. So we try to make sure we get the right ads that will work properly. So if the ad is going to be built by the Cortland Standard, the salespeople will draw up a dummy to help guide the ad designers as they create a draft, which is then sent back and forth until the advertiser eventually, hopefully, will approve it and it's scheduled for its run. And once our people in the composing room know what ads are going in the next day's edition, we have a layout specialist who puts the format of the paper, because it can be a 16, a 20, a 24, a 20 page that also needs to be a 24, so we have to print an extra 4 pages first thing in the morning. And they're amazing. Annette Buffamonte is our layout specialist, and she knows all the advertisers, where they like to be, where they don't like to be, who can't be on the same page or facing pages, things of that nature. So it really is a balancing act to get them all in there. And if we have a lot of the color ads, which once again we can only put on the front and the back of sections, and some of those fronts of sections are the front page of the paper where we can't put too big of an ad, or the front page of the sports section where we can't put too big of an ad, then we'll have to do that extra 4 pages first thing in the morning. At which point everyone gets a list of all the ads that go in the paper and where they are, how many pages they are, and they start putting the news in place. Some pages will be filled the day before publication, such as the opinion page, the community page, and living and leisure, which is 4, 5, and 6, not in that order. While others are left open to be filled with the most current versions of news stories the morning of. For a lot of us, the office hours are fairly normal, banker's hours, but we have many employees who begin their workday while it's still dark out. Pressmen are some of the first employees to arrive. Most mornings they're there at about 5:30, and they clean up the 50-year-old press. And I've been told on many, many occasions that we have one of the best maintained presses and press rooms that any of our vendors have seen. And having visited numerous newspapers in the state, I can assure you, oh yeah, you could eat off the floor of ours, and others are just coated in ink and grime and oil. And we were very proud of what our press foreman, Ray Marsh, does to maintain that, along with his men. So if there's a special section or a real estate book, the pressman will start the press first thing in the morning for that. And as of late June of this year, we use a new computer-to-plate system that images the plates directly from computer files, which is a major leap forward. As I described the film earlier, film is expensive. It involves silver. Then there's chemistry to process it. And then there's just a lot more steps in film these days. Is a thing. It's getting tough. So we were kind of trucking along, just waiting for the axe to fall, and that would be the end of film, and we'd have to have an emergency and invest in the new technology. So instead of that, we're saving some money. We have a much higher, better print quality most days, unless something is wonky on the press itself. It's been a really great leap forward for us. Once the plates are finished, the pressmen bend them, punch holes in them, then they have to bend them, and then they slot them onto the press. And so everything has to be in the right order as well on the press. So it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they have to know what goes where, and there's actually on each unit of the press, there's 4 different spots for plates. So it can get very confusing, and luckily our guys know what they're doing. So if they're running something special first thing in the morning, we get our inserters, who are the people who put the insert ads into the paper, up in the circulation department. The finished papers come off of a conveyor belt at the end of that, and the pressmen start the press, and then they put the inserts in that special section or early run or whatever, and get going on packages, which include flyers for chain grocery, home improvement, drug and department stores, as well as ads for local retailers. And the insert room is full to the brim with stacks of these inserts, which we also call preprints, and as well as the packages that are the final product. And it gets rather complicated because we have a lot of different towns and villages in addition to the city, and different retailers want their ads in specific areas, perhaps close to the store or in a demographic area where they think they'll get customers. And so the zoning, as it's called, really requires complicated logistics to pull off. It increases our costs. It didn't used to be like that. If you had an ad, it went everywhere. But over time, the advertisers figured out, wait, we can pay them to do what we want, and we want this. So it's other newspapers buckled, and we're paying the price. About 6 years ago, we actually purchased an inserting machine, which is a standalone unit. It's not hooked directly into the press. and both the newspaper and insert packages will be loaded into the machine, and it'll go chunk, 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 and fill all those things in there. But every now and then we get stuff that just doesn't work, and we have to do it by hand still. But we're getting better all the time, and not doing as much hand inserting as we used to. Back upstairs in the newsroom, meanwhile, our sports department, which is Taney Beaumont, the editor, and sports writer Tom Vartanian, as well as our page designers, have come in early, 6:37, and begin filling the pages in that day's edition. Page designers pull the stories off the Associated Press newsfeed and put them on the right pages: world, nation, state, etc. Sports. And then with all the ads, photos, headlines, and assorted graphics, the process can be a lot like building a puzzle. There are rules of design to follow, and they can both be helpful when you look at a blank page and go, what do I do? And challenging when you look at a page that you already put 3 stories on and goes, what did I do? So to tell you the truth, it's one of the duties at the paper I really enjoyed when I spent time there. It was a neat task every day. And meanwhile, the other editors and reporters have filtered in, and they're wrapping up the local stories, and they're trying to figure out what local copy goes where on the page 3, our local page, as well as what goes out front in terms of national and local news, or state news for that matter. And meanwhile, the sports guys are doing their things, and the page designers are at a dead sprint as they assemble the pages and proof pages to check for errors. The front page and local news pages are usually fully assembled at about 10:45. So 1, 2, 3 are usually some of our last pages. And at that time, all the dummies go out, or proofs, excuse me, go out, and I, and along with a few of my editors, gave them either a quick look, depending on what else is going on in my case, or just very, very carefully look for mistakes. And the mantra that was taught to me as when I first started in the publisher's office was headlines and captions. Check those extra carefully. I'm told we had a Heath Care slip in recently. And those are the most noticeable and least forgivable mistakes to make. They're just right there in front of you, and we don't see it because we know what it's supposed to say, and so your stupid brain fills in the rest, even though you're missing that L in Heath Care. So we try to keep close eye on that, and dates as well at the top of the paper. But sometimes other errors slip through, and I apologize for that, but hey, when you're publishing thousands of words every day, give us a break. We try our best, believe me. Throughout the morning, the page designers have been sending the completed pages to the new computer-to-plate system. The pressmen now sit in front of a computer and go, okay, and from there the plates go to a machine where it says, that's how I understand all machines work, apparently. And so it's just a big box. You hit OK on the computer, the machine starts humming, and then a finished plate sticks out the other end, at which point we punch it, bend it, stick it on the press. The paper is usually ready to be printed at 11:30. I'd rather get a little earlier, sometimes a little later. Breaking news happens. But once the final plates are in place, the press is turned on, and some fairly ugly copies of the newspaper begin to roll off the belt. Occasionally they get out as well. If something happens in the middle of the run, or we try to run down the newsprint rolls, so we get to the very, very end of it, which is just a cardboard core and a few wraps of paper, at which point we have to stop the press, take that off, and put on another roll, and then you have to start it up again, at which point you get some of those ugly copies. We try our best not to let those out because it's not great for our advertisers to get an ad that just looks a bit junky, and we do our best. We've been struggling with some press problems recently, I think predominantly caused by the humidity, which causes things to get a little sticky, and it just causes problems that we don't need. But it's what happens is when you have 1, 2, 10. You've got 10 different, on some papers, rolls spinning at the same time. And so you have to get those lined up. It's called registration. And if they're not, it'll look a little blurry. Y'all might have seen that. Keep an eye out. Try to catch our mistakes. If it gets a little blurry, it's a press problem. When the copies start to look good, the pressman gives the okay. The inserters take it off the belt, put everything together where it needs to go, make sure it goes to the right independent dealers who also do some inserting. And it's a bit of a controlled chaos. Everyone knows what they're doing. They've done it for years, but it's still just running back and forth with stacks of 50 at a time and getting things strapped and bundled and inserted into the right people. And hey, no, it's not his turn, it's mine. So it works. We do it every day except Sundays and holidays. The largest package is usually Saturday's papers, probably most of you know, and it gets pretty heavy. And the adult carriers and the youth carriers roll in the afternoon, and well, the youth is when they get out of school. And we require for the routes that we are able to manage ourselves that every paper gets delivered by 5 p.m. And so when you have some students getting out at 2:33, they're rushing to get them across town. And then right after press time, one of our page designers updates our website with the day's local news, local sports, just one of each, and then classifieds and death and birth notices. And meanwhile, drivers are making drops at newsstands and the coin boxes, the reporters are making phone calls and talking over story ideas with editors, the classified department is taking ads, our business office is handling the same type of accounts receivable, accounts payable, things like that, that a lot of people do. Classified department is taking calls, putting together ads, and the next day's paper slowly comes together. No rest for the weary. So that is my pitch such as it is, and I would be happy to take any questions from the audience.
Thank you.
So you mentioned plates every day. What happens to the plates? Are they reusable or
Nope.
reground?
No,
or-
once they've gotten used and taken off the press, they're essentially worthless.
What are they made of?
Aluminum. We do sell them in big stacks. They're covered in ink, so it's up to buyer beware. But some people I know have used them for kind of roofing projects, chicken coop here and there. So people do buy them. Otherwise, there is a little silver left on the plate, I believe. So we do collect them and every now and then talk to a precious metals dealer who will give us a few pennies back.
Give tours?
Unfortunately, no. When the newspaper industry was riding high in the hog, for whatever reason, they didn't decide to get the building compliant with the American with Disabilities Act. And at this time, I just don't have the resources no, I just don't have the resources. I would love to. I really would. That's why I'm perfectly happy to come talk to any group or any business or any what have you and just let them know what's going on when I can. It's unfortunate, but we got to comply with the law and can't do it.
Does that mean that you have to be handicapped accessible for either employees, second, third floor? Do you have an elevator from
We do.
ground floor up?
We do have an elevator, but it's
It's a freight elevator.
yes, very freight. Anyone else?
Yeah, the AP stuff, you pay by subscription, you pay an annual fee, or you pay by the number of stories you pull and put in the paper? How does that work?
Annual fee. Annual fee. We have a contract for 5 years. Actually, I'll give you guys a little hint of what's kind of going through my mind. I've talked to a few other newspapers in the state, and they're thinking of actually pulling back from the Associated Press. It's not something I want to do right away because I know a great many people still probably get a lot of their national, state, world news from the Cortland Standard, but with so many other outlets out there providing essentially the same thing, I've been thinking that sometime in the future, I've talked with other publishers about combining our efforts across the state, the independent papers, and being able to provide a statewide news network that at least could catch some of that stuff that you aren't going to see on CNN or Fox News. So it's increasingly obvious that our real bread and butter is the local news, and that's going to be the case moving forward.
So would you pay a lesser fee than a larger publication?
Yeah, it's based on circulation. So, we're a little guy. They're not going to ding us for quite as much as the Post Standard or
Your
Bing.
time or something?
Yeah. Yes.
What do you think the future holds for the paper? Where do you think you'll be in 20 years from now?
In 20 years, I'd like to hope that we'll be thinking of ceasing the print edition in 20 years and not before that. And we are exploring possibilities. I've actually been talking with a software vendor over the last week or two about a way to easily get a computer system that instead of having to hire somebody to manually upload all these things on the website, right now it's done after the paper goes out by somebody with primary duties elsewhere. We could just have it kind of no-brainer. You just click a button, everything goes to the right spot on the website. So I'm looking to really start to get a more digital forward approach in the next year or two, hopefully not any longer, and it would be a fee for subscription to the stuff online. In the early days of the internet, all the newspapers put everything out there for free. Everything was free online. And it was a terrible idea because we trained the first consumers of news online to expect it to be free. And in the last 10 years, that's largely disappeared for the newspapers. They have started putting up some very, very modest subscription prices for digital news. And the modest subscription price isn't going to pay 4 reporters, 2 editors, 2 sports writers, along with ad designers and all that. It's just pennies on the dollar that you get online, which is why people look at the Cortland Standard and go, they've never even heard of the internet. No, we know it's there. It's just we need to be able to survive, and the pittance you get from digital isn't great. So we're working on it. Since we gave the website just a facelift in October, actually, our revenue on that has gone up by a huge amount. So I know there's money to be made there. We just need to get to the point where it's a big culture change as well, in addition to having to buy a program or 2. So we're working on it. I want to be there. I know we need to be there, so we will get there.
You're aware that the big papers, they know how many times the readers have visited, because people keep suggesting, for instance, Washington Post articles to me, and the Washington Post recognized the 5th one I was at and said, gee, you visit here a lot, I think you need to subscribe to keep reading these.
Yep.
Well, I thought of telling people to start forwarding me articles from different papers, but they didn't do that.
I used to run into that too. I subscribe to the New York Times and Washington Post online only because I need to consume news so I can write editorials and things like that. There are a number of different models. That's the kind of limited. You get a few, and then they put up the paywall for the next month. There are other people who just maybe give you a story or 2 and say you want the rest of it, pay. There's also a metered system where you kind of pay per article, which seems unnecessarily complicated. Because you start putting a price on each article, and people are going to start questioning what the price of each article really is.
You got to tempt us in for free, but then the per article is.
Yeah. No, that's not great. So even then, we'd have to come up with a good solution that really would make sense. To me, I still think that the news is incredibly valuable to our lives. So when I roll out an e-edition, it's likely not going to be very inexpensive, because very inexpensive doesn't keep you getting news. We're going to have to find a good price point that people can afford and that they find value in, but also will keep the lights on. So. Another hard question to answer.
How discreet does your zoning get that the advertisers are after you for? Do you do different parts of the city or just different zip codes? Or?
We have newsstands, which are gas stations or other retail stores inside the city, and newsstands outside the city in 13045. And then it'll be, for example, homes in not 14850, that's the other guy. Homes in one zip code and not stores, or it'll be stores in that zip code and not homes. So it's not terrible, but we've got a lot of zip codes going on. So it can be pretty obnoxious. And it's also creates problems, because somebody says, why didn't I get Value Home or Tops? Well, not Tops, that's pretty full. But why didn't I get Value Home or Lowe's in my paper? I said, they didn't pay to send it to you. Sorry.
So for a while, people would take a local newspaper and scan it into Facebook or scan it into another social media site. Are there laws against that, or typically what happens? If you live someplace part of the year and live someplace else part of the year, papers were being scanned in, and all of a sudden, it seems, I don't know, maybe people got tired of doing it, not being compensated.
I would. It's not a huge problem, frankly. We get eyes on the paper anyways, and as long as they're Ben newspapers, somebody said, I finished it, do you want it, and handed it over the railing to their neighbor. We want to keep the customers we have. We want people to recognize the value, and that you can't enjoy the newspaper if you don't help support the newspaper. We're a business, we're not a not-for-profit agency. No offense. No offense. But we provide a service and a product both to our advertisers and our subscribers. And
are you copyrighted?
Some of what we produce is, yes.
I'm sure it is.
I think it would stand up in court.
That sounds like your Grandpa Paul.
I think that's where it started, yeah. else? You don't get me that often. But actually, my door is always open. My phone is always on, ready to be answered. So please, if any of you ever have any questions, concerns, comments, hot tips, please call me. If you want your name kept out of the police blotter, don't bother calling. Haven't done that for anyone yet, and I'm told no one else has. So it gets us in trouble. But
That's why he carried the gun.
not me. Not right now. We report the news without fear or favor, so I get a lot of calls. It's actually stopped in the last few years. It doesn't happen as much, but I used to get calls from people saying, I got picked up last night. Could you please keep my name out of the paper? And I say, I don't do it for my employees. I wouldn't do it for my family. And no, I can't. It's just not fair to anyone else who has ever appeared in it. That somebody. It's not good enough. That's not the standard we try to abide by.
Yes.
Wish they'd stop saying elderly people. Anybody over 40 is an elderly person.
Yes,
You don't need that descriptor.
because the age is there. The age is there. We can all make our own judgments. I actually have run into that before, and I think what happened when Kevin Howe retired, he was really good at catching those kind of things. Older people would be perfectly acceptable. I hope, where did an elderly
Just to be
slip?
an older person. For an older person, that isn't, it's like.
Older than who?
Then, yeah.
And me.
You're just people.
You're right. No, I'll keep an eye out for that. And it's amazing how much these words can get you in trouble. We try to maintain a standard of don't print anything you wouldn't want your own grandmother to read. And that's a bit subjective. My mother is a grandmother, and she'd probably read some pretty nasty stuff. But it's a good way to think about it, at least. It's a family paper. Make it for the family.
And then other times, someone is identified by their occupation, being former teacher.
Mhm.
I would notice that if a teacher ever got caught doing something, they were always identified as a teacher. Whereas if Joe Blow, who works at Exxon, isn't identified where they work.
I haven't run into that in a while.
Not a while, but
Yeah.
it's happened.
We've tried to move away from some of that. Something that really bothers me, and I try to police it carefully, is when we identify a lady by her husband, like, blank's husband, blank's wife, which is no. Or vice versa, blank's husband, which is how I describe it sometimes. But yeah, we try to step away from that. The most recent, when it's a political figure, someone who's very much in the public eye, and I wouldn't consider a teacher in the public eye, but when it's a political figure, we will probably identify them, their position. Most recently, and that hasn't come up in a while, but most recently, we published a police beat item with an employee, and we actually did identify their title in that item because we wanted to be on the up and up, and once again, our own employees make it in there, and it's not because we're picking on them, it's because it's our job to print what the public wants to see.
They don't want to see it in the papers, they shouldn't do it. That's what I told my kids.
I don't tell that to people who are upset in the mornings and they call up. I frame it as an issue of fairness.
As a mother, that's what I raised the kids and said, if you don't want to see it print, don't do it.
Well, that's a mother's
You don't close with talk to your mother about this?
No. It's much easier to explain it the other way. Joseph?
Yeah, since we can't come and tour your facility, is there any chance you would do a photographic article to show people what it's like to be there?
Yes. Rats. What I would have liked to have done a lot of that in our 150th, but it ended up selling too well. It's terrible. I ran my ad manager up and down and said, what are you doing selling all these ads? So we got a bit tight for space, and we didn't get to make it as visual as I really wanted it to be. I would love to have had a picture of each department, but I can put it on the... What I should do actually is really put together a slideshow presentation.
And
Yeah,
that on
that
Yeah.
would be great.
Online, yeah.
Well, my speech is getting stale. At least one of you, I think, has heard the bulk of it before. So maybe that'll be my next time somebody invites me to talk. I'll start doing that. But online would be good too, because self-promotion is something.
It's a process, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I can talk about the machines and make the sound effects, but it doesn't really give you an idea.
Like we looked at your 95, the
Yeah.
1910 edition, and all the presses in different rooms and.
Yeah. So the website would be a good spot for that.
Why can't you give tours?
Just not, it's so,
OSHA wouldn't like it, would they?
no, OSHA wouldn't like it to have members of the public touring the building when it's not American with Disability Act compliant.
You just need a good lawyer to draft you the right release, people coming in the door.
That's true, that's true.
You'd have to block off a lot of spots where you can only peek through a window for safety.
Yeah, that too.
Safety would be the big thing, I would think.
Yes, it's an old building, and when that's beautiful, it's a beautiful old building, it's also a
Are there
really
any
old building.
remnants of the Y being there, like part of the gym floor or?
Not that I've really been able to identify. It sounds, I think I know which part of the building it was in, but now I've got a big thick paper cutter in there, as well as my HVAC distribution system. So we took over the entire building at some point, and I think that was perhaps the late 60s, and even earlier we had started to absorb all the building. And since then it's been overrun with our junk. Not junk, antiques. Treasured collectibles.
So now, when you went back to that corner that is now the Cortland Standard, when they went in there to operate as a newspaper, they operated in a small portion on Tompkins Street side of the building?
Yes.
It was rented out to pay for the building, maybe?
Probably, because my guess is it wasn't cheap. It's the behemoth. But yeah, it sounds like we had a storefront on Tompkins Street, and our press was in the basement. And then I know there was at least Meldrum's Paint was where our press room currently is, where you can look in the window, I think. And we still have a door in the far back of the building that was part of that. What's really neat is in our press room, I don't know if you can see it from the front from the front window, we have a pressed tin ceiling in there. It's a two-story building now because we eliminated the floor, or two-story room because we eliminated the floor. Well, there's gorgeous pressed tin ceiling, and the paint on the pressed tin ceiling is falling in the press, which generates some problems from here and there. It's one of the things on my list where I don't want to rip that out. God
I
forbid.
think that was the fair store.
The fair store.
Was it?
Was one of the storefronts.
And then
Post
and
office was in the
Munson's.
exact corner.
Then it was Munson's.
Munson's was the Stila Pain store.
Once again, in preparing for the 150th, I kept running into these things, and actually, I'm more familiar with the history than I had been previously, and I'll forget it all soon.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
It was very nice.
Thank you very much.